Picture this: a chilly January evening in Beirut, 1963. The sun has gone down over the Mediterranean. In a quiet corner of the city, a British journalist, at least that's what it says on his business card, sits alone on a hotel balcony, looking out over the water. He is in his early 50s, dark hair receding, a drink in his hand. On the table beside him lies a packet of British newspapers, a diplomatic bag label, and an unopened letter from London. The name on his passport is Harold Adrian Russell Philby. Everyone calls him Kim. Some of the people who think they know him would describe him as the finest intelligence officer Britain ever produced, a man who helped build the special relationship between MI6 and the CIA. Others, who have started to see through the mask, whisper a different phrase: the third man. Only 2 countries really know who he is. One of them gave him a desk at the heart of its Secret Service. The other gave him a colonel's rank in the KGB. And tonight, as the waves lap at the Beirut shore, he knows that time is running out. Men from London have come to ask questions he cannot afford to answer. In Moscow, another set of men have prepared a backup plan. A ship sits in the harbor. To understand how a man ends up with one foot in MI6 and the other in Soviet intelligence, you have to go back 3 decades, to a different world and a different war. Kim Philby is born in 1912, the son of St. John Philby, an eccentric British official and explorer who spends years in Arabia. The family moves through the British imperial orbit. Kim grows up surrounded by stories of empire, diplomacy, and foreign intrigue. He goes to Westminster School, then to Trinity College, Cambridge, in the early 1930s. There, he moves in the same rarefied atmosphere as a small group of bright, restless young men who will later be known simply as the Cambridge Five. The world outside Cambridge is convulsed by crisis. The Great Depression has shattered economies, Hitler is rising in Germany, Mussolini has turned Italy into the first modern fascist state. Many students look at the failures of capitalism and the weakness of liberal democracies and decide that Marxism makes more sense. Kim is one of them. At Cambridge, he attends communist meetings, reads Marx and Lenin, and joins student organizations that support the Soviet Union and the Spanish Republic. His friends, including Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, move in the same circles. For Soviet intelligence, Cambridge in these years is a recruiting ground. They send talent spotters like Arnold Deutsch to identify potential agents who meet 3 criteria. They are from the right class, they are genuinely convinced that capitalism is doomed, and they are ambitious enough to aim for high office. Kim Philby checks all 3 boxes. Under Deutsch's guidance, he's recruited into the NKVD network. The first thing they tell him to do is simple: disappear. Not physically, but politically. Leave the Communist Party, stop attending public meetings, distance yourself from left-wing friends, reinvent yourself as a conservative, or at least as a politically safe establishment man. Aim not for the trade union hall, but for the heart of the British state. He obeys. In the mid-1930s, Philby goes to Vienna, where he marries an Austrian communist, works with socialist groups, and witnesses fascist street battles. When the Austrian government cracks down on the left, he helps smuggle people out. It is dangerous work, but it also deepens his belief that fascism is the immediate enemy, and that the Soviet Union is the only serious force standing against it. When he returns to Britain, he begins to rebuild his public life. He moves into journalism. He becomes a correspondent for the Times and other outlets, eventually going to Spain to cover the Spanish Civil War from the nationalist side. There, he carefully cultivates the image of a right-leaning, anti-communist reporter. He is wounded while covering the war and is even decorated by Franco's regime. For those who don't know his past, this looks like a complete transformation. For Soviet intelligence, it looks like a perfect cover. He has washed his record clean in the eyes of Britain's conservative establishment. World War II begins. Britain needs people who speak languages, know foreign countries, and understand politics. In 1940, Philby is recruited into MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, starting in Section V, the Counter-Espionage Section. It is the unit that deals with enemy spies and political subversion. From that moment on, everything he does for MI6, he also does for the KGB. He learns how MI6 is structured, who runs which section, what the priorities are. He learns the procedures for recruiting agents, running operations, and liaising with other agencies. He passes all of that structure to Moscow. He also begins to feed the Soviets the fruits of MI6's own successes. He tells them about Britain's early code-breaking achievements, the organization of the Special Operations Executive, the plans for sabotage and political warfare in Europe. He is careful not to reveal everything at once. He wants to remain useful for years. By 1944, he's been promoted to head of Section 9, MI6's new anti-Soviet section. In plain English, he is now the man in charge of Britain's efforts to detect and disrupt Soviet intelligence operations. From Moscow's point of view, this is almost too good to be true. Their own man is sitting on top of the unit that is supposed to hunt their other men. He uses that position ruthlessly. In 1945, a Soviet intelligence officer in Istanbul named Konstantin Volkov approaches the British consulate with an extraordinary offer. He wants to defect. He offers to reveal the identities of 2 Soviet agents in the British Foreign Office and Intelligence Service, along with details of the Soviet spy network in the West. His message is sent to London. It lands on the desk of Kim Philby. Philby understands immediately what this means. One of the men Volkov is talking about is Donald Maclean. The other is almost certainly himself. If Volkov reaches alive, the game may be over. Philby informs Moscow. He stalls the British response, claiming he needs more time to arrange a secure extraction. While London waits, Soviet agents move fast. Volkov and his wife are seized in Istanbul, bundled onto a plane, and flown back to Moscow. They are never seen again. Philby has bought himself and his ring more time. After the war, the strategic landscape shifts. The alliance with the Soviet Union turns into a Cold War. The United States emerges with unprecedented scientific and industrial power. It has built the bomb at Los Alamos, developed long-range bombers, and begun to build radar networks and early warning systems. Britain, exhausted, still maintains a global presence, but is clearly no longer the senior partner in the Western world. In this new world, intelligence cooperation between MI6 and the newly formed CIA becomes crucial. And who better to manage that cooperation on the British side than a man who has proven his skill in both field work and analytics? In 1949, Kim Philby is sent to Washington as first secretary at the British Embassy and as MI6's chief liaison to the CIA and FBI. On paper, he is the point man for Anglo-American intelligence cooperation. He attends high-level meetings, coordinates joint operations, and sits in on discussions of strategy and capability. In reality, he is also reporting to Moscow on the organizational charts of the CIA, including who runs what and who can be targeted, the details of joint MI6-CIA operations, such as attempts to infiltrate anti-communist guerrillas into Albania and other Eastern Bloc states, the internal debates in Washington about how aggressively to push covert action behind the Iron Curtain. One of the operations he sabotages from Washington is the Albanian campaign. The idea, cooked up in London and Washington, is to land small teams of Albanian exiles on the coast who will then organize resistance against Enver Hoxha's communist regime and possibly prepare the way for a coup. MI6 and the CIA train the men, provide them with radios and weapons, and send them in. Philby informs the KGB. Albanian security forces, tipped off in advance, wait on the beaches and in the mountains. Many of the teams are killed or captured almost immediately. The operation turns into a disaster, demoralizing the exiles and giving the Soviets a propaganda victory. For the men who died on those beaches, the secret war is not a spy thriller. It's a fatal ambush set up by information flowing the wrong way. Even as Philby is quietly sabotaging operations, another part of the American machine is slowly closing in on the ring he belongs to. At Arlington Hall, U.S. Army codebreakers working on a long-term project known as Venona are deciphering fragments of Soviet wartime communications. The Soviets had used one-time pads to encrypt their most sensitive traffic, ciphers that should be theoretically unbreakable. But in the chaos of war, they made a critical mistake. They reused some pads. That mistake, multiplied over dozens of messages, gave American cryptonaticists just enough leverage to begin peeling back the cipher. As they do, they start to see reports sent by Soviet stations in New York, Washington, and London. Those reports mention sources with code names, including an atomic spy in the Manhattan Project, a British diplomat in Washington, and others inside British and American institutions. By cross-referencing these clues with known details, U.S. and British analysts managed to identify Klaus Fuchs and Donald Maclean as Soviet sources. For Maclean, the codename is Homer. By 1950 to 51, Venona has given MI5 enough confidence to move on him. Philby, sitting in Washington as liaison, is part of the small circle informed about the growing suspicion around Homer. He knows that a British diplomat in Washington, now back in London, is under investigation. He can put two and two together. He informs Moscow. Moscow orders that Maclean be withdrawn before his interrogation. The KGB chooses Guy Burgess, already in trouble in Washington for drunk driving and misconduct and about to be sent back to London to handle the exfiltration. Burgess returns to Britain, meets with Maclean, and on May 25, 1951, the two men drive to Southampton and board a ship for France under assumed names, beginning their journey to Moscow. When this becomes known, suspicion naturally turns to the small group of people who knew Homer was about to be interrogated. Philby is now an obvious candidate. He's recalled to London in 1951 and subjected to prolonged questioning by MI5. He denies everything. The interrogators have strong suspicions and circumstantial evidence, but they cannot present Venona intercepts in court without revealing to the world and to the Soviets that they have broken parts of Soviet cipher systems. Without admissible proof, the government faces a dilemma. In 1955, Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan stands up in the House of Commons and tells Parliament that Philby was not and has never been a Soviet agent. The statement is politically useful. It calms a scandal. It also happens to be false. To many in Washington, this looks like Britain choosing face-saving over security. Philby resigns from MI6 but is not prosecuted. For several years, he lives quietly, working as a journalist. Then, in 1956, the intelligence service quietly brings him back as a contract agent and sends him to Beirut as foreign correspondent for The Observer and The Economist. On the surface, he is now a foreign correspondent, filing pieces on regional politics, coups, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In reality, he is still playing a double game. He sends reports to MI6, he maintains contact with the KGB. From Beirut, he is perfectly placed to talk to diplomats, businessmen, and other journalists. He drinks heavily in the city's bars, gathers gossip, and continues to sit at the intersection of two intelligence worlds. Then, in 1961, a new factor enters the picture. A KGB officer named Anatoly Golitsyn defects to the West, providing a flood of information about Soviet operations. Among his claims is that there is, or was until recently, a highly placed mole in MI6 whose career and characteristics match Philby's. For those in London and Washington who never believed Macmillan's exoneration, this is confirmation. MI5 decides that the time for ambiguity is over. They send Nicholas Elliot to Beirut. Elliot is not any officer. He's an old friend of Philby's, one of the men who had defended him in the 1950s, convinced he could not be a traitor. In late 1962 and early 1963, Elliot meets Philby in Beirut, in apartments and hotel rooms where they talk late into the night. This time, the tone is different. Elliot lays out what they know, the Venona decrypts, the connections to Burgess and Maclean, Galitzin's testimony, and the inconsistencies in Philby's own stories. Philby can see that the wall is closing in. Accounts of their conversations differ. Some say Philby admitted being a Soviet contact during the war and claimed he had cut ties after 1945. Others say he made broader admissions. Either way, Elliot makes it clear that the British government is prepared to bring him back to London under a kind of informal immunity deal if he agrees to confess fully and help map out the damage. Philby listens. He knows what would await him in London. He has seen what happened to other traitors. He also knows he has another option. Shortly afterwards, he disappears. Most likely, he walks up a gangway onto a Soviet freighter in Beirut harbor under cover of night, aided by KGB handlers who have been watching events closely. The ship sails. For several days, his whereabouts are unknown. When he reappears, months later, it is not in London. It is in Moscow. In July 1963, Soviet authorities announced that Kim Philby has been granted asylum and Soviet citizenship. The man once publicly cleared in the House of Commons is now standing on Soviet soil, smiling, talking about how he has always served the right side. In the West, the shock is intense. The CIA and FBI realize that the man who once sat in their offices, drank in their clubs, and read their files was an enemy all along. MI6 has to face the fact that its former head of anti-Soviet operations was a Soviet agent. For the KGB, it is a propaganda coup. They present Philby as a hero of the working class, a man born into privilege who saw the injustice of imperialism and chose to serve the oppressed. Behind the propaganda, there is a more practical role. Philby is given the rank of colonel in the KGB. He moves into a Moscow apartment, learns Russian more fluently, and begins teaching at the KGB's own training academy. He lectures new generations of Soviet officers on how MI6 works, its culture, its recruitment methods, its strengths and vulnerabilities. He writes his memoir, My Silent War, which is published in 1968. It is partly truthful, partly deceptive, crafted under KGB supervision to present his life as the story of a man who never wavered from his ideological path. From Moscow, he watches the world change. He sees the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which American surveillance aircraft, reconnaissance ships, and signal intercepts give Washington a detailed picture of Soviet deployments on the island. He sees how American technology, U-2s, later satellites, turns much of the planet into something that can be photographed and measured without a single spy stepping across a border. He must understand at some level that the world he operated in, of men in trench coats sneaking papers out of safes, is being transformed by circuits and lenses. He also lives long enough to see the Soviet system begin to stagnate. Publicly, he remains loyal. He gives interviews to Western journalists in which he defends his choices and insists that history will judge him kindly. Privately, according to his wife and some friends, he struggles with alcoholism, boredom, and a sense of exile. He misses English conversation, British humor, certain foods. He knows he will never go back. He dies in Moscow in 1988, a few years before the Soviet Union collapses. From a purely espionage perspective, his damage is immense. He gave the KGB a blueprint of MI6's structure and methods, sabotaged operations in Eastern Europe, costing lives, shielded and warned other Soviet agents like Maclean and Burgess, helped the Soviets map Anglo-American intelligence cooperation, including early CIA capabilities. But from a broader Cold War perspective, his story also highlights something about the balance between human espionage and technology. Philby's greatest weapon was his access. He could open safes, sit in meetings, listen to conversations. He could take what he learned and send it to Moscow. The Soviets were very good at recruiting and running such agents, especially in the 1930s and 1940s. What they did not anticipate was that on the other side of the ocean, the Americans were building something different. A system that could uncover spies not by stumbling across them, but by reading their mail. The Venona Project is a perfect example. In unremarkable buildings in Virginia, American cryptanalysts, mathematicians, and engineers work with early computers and mountains of paper, trying to tease patterns out of gibberish. They are not glamorous, they do not carry guns, they sit at desks and write code. But they managed to break into a cipher system that the Soviets believed was mathematically unbreakable. From those broken messages, they see red flags. They see hints that there is a Homer in the British Embassy, a Charles in the Manhattan Project, an unidentified mole in MI6. They warn their allies. The process is slow, imperfect, and fraught with bureaucracy, but it gives the West something the Soviets lack: an independent, technologically driven window into their adversaries' secret world. Philby's success in warning Maclean and Burgess and his ability to cover his tracks for years show how vulnerable Western services could be when they relied on trust and social background instead of rigorous vetting and technical surveillance. Philby's eventual exposure shows what happens when that trust is augmented by machines. For American viewers, there is a very specific lesson in all this. The Soviet Union could recruit individuals. It could turn idealistic students into traitors. It could penetrate foreign ministries and labs. But it consistently underestimated what a technologically advanced, open society could do in response. It underestimated the ability of American codebreakers to break its ciphers. It underestimated the reach of American aircraft and satellites to see its deployments. It underestimated the capacity of American industry to build not just bombs, but computers, communications networks, and sensors that made secrecy harder every year. Philby's life is, on one level, a monument to Soviet success. On another, it is a monument to Soviet fear. They had to place him where they did because they could not match, on their own, the information environment of the West. They needed him to balance out American and British advantages. In the short run, he did. In the long run, the project he served could not keep up with the one he betrayed. He died under a red flag. That flag no longer flies over the Kremlin. The institutions he undermined are still there. And that, for an American audience, is the deeper context around the most famous mole inside MI6. A man whose very existence shows how far Soviet intelligence had to go to reach parity with Western knowledge, and whose final fate shows how far short his chosen side ultimately fell.